First of all, you gotta pull your ashtray out, then unscrew your shift knob, pop the shift cover off, and then on the center console you have two screws here on the inside, and you have screw here, screw here. Whole thing just pops right up. Then you have 4 screws here. You have a screw here, screw here, a screw here, screw here, and then 2 more that you gotta get into underneath the bottom of it. Then you have your drive shaft where it connects to the differential, the back of the car. You got 4 nuts. These on this side don't actually turn because it's locked in through there. So you'll actually remove this nut on this side. Get a better shot of that. There's 4 of them. Just break them loose with a 14mm opening wrench and probably like a bar over the wrench for better leverage. Put your e-brake on and break the 2 bottom ones. Then release your e-brake and spin the tire to get the other top 2 and spin them off, and then pull the drive shaft down. You have 2 bolts there that you need to remove. There's 2 more on the other side. They're 12mm nuts. Then you have your center bearing where it hooks to the car. You have a nut on each side. They're 17mm nuts. That's where it hooks it to the car. So you remove that and you get the plate off right behind it and have it unhooked from the differential. You'll just slide it out, like back towards the rear of the car. Just grab both ends of it because it's going to be flexible because it's got the joints on it. Just pull it out of the rear of the transmission and just slide it out from under the car. Okay, I went ahead and pulled it off the car because it's going to be easier for you to see this from under the car. But everything's set up just like it would be under the car. First thing you need to do is remove the bolts and nuts that hook it to the differential. You have 4 14mm nuts and bolts. Basically all it's got to do, the nut that goes in right here on this side locks down so it don't turn. So all you do is remove the nut on the other side and then those slide out. Remove your center bearing bolts, which are 17mm, there's 1 on each side. And then when you get that off, you can remove this plate right here. It's 2 12mm nuts on this side and 1 12mm nut on this side, and pull that off. Then just grab the whole drive shaft. You might have to pull the bottom down just a little bit in the middle. Just slide the whole thing back, slide it out. Watch out for some transmission fluid to come out the shaft up in the front though, because a little bit will come out still, but it won't be too awful bad. And this is your passenger side motor mount nut. Would go right there. I've already removed mine. I'll just leave mine connect to the engine, remove the bottom bolt. It would go up in there. Right there's where the passenger side, the driver's side motor mount nut would go. 19mm. Probably need a 19mm deep well socket for those. Alright, when you're removing your transmission mount and motor mounts, you need to put a jack underneath the transmission like we have it here. You need to put it there so it don't fall down on you because it's going to lower a lot. So after you remove your mount and your motor mounts, you can remove the jack then. And have your jack jacked under your transmission, because when you remove these bolts on the outside, it's going to fall off. You have 2 17mm nuts on each side that you need to remove. Next you have your crank angle sensor, which you have a connector that hooks to the harness right here. And also you have a 10mm bolt that hooks to this plate right here. You need to remove those. And then this whole sensor just slides out of the transmission. That's what it looks like. You cannot leave it in there, because if you leave it in there you'll break this, because it's really fragile and it'll break and it'll hit the flywheel or flex plate or whatever when you're pulling it off the transmission off the motor. So you need to remove this whole piece. It's a pain in the butt to get out, but you'll be able to do it. You got your gusset bolts you need to remove. There's 4 14mm bolts. all right there. On the starter, you need to remove the wiring for it. There's a 12mm bolt right here. You have a rubber boot on the harness you need to pull off to get that, remove that bolt. And then next you have this connector for the starter. It needs to be disconnected from the harness. So to remove the starter, you got two 14mm bolts you need to remove. There's your starter motor. Next on the belt housing, you have a 14mm here to remove. Then you have your 14mm ball on here. Next you have this one on, it's a 14mm bolt. It's right above where your gusset bolt was. You remove that one, and then next above it you have another one. And then next above that you have another one, which is right beside your crank angle sensor. And that's it. When you're going to remove your transmission from the motor underneath the car, you want to make sure you break your header to your cat apart so it is able to flex. Make sure you remove your transmission cross member to the chassis so it'll drop down. Loosen your motor mount bolts so it'll still rock back. Remove your complete drive shaft. Also up top here, make sure your intake's removed from the motor because it's going to kick back. And then your transmission's going to lay down some. It's going to fall back on the rear of it, just like that. And it'll give you enough room to get your hands up there on top of the bell house and remove all the bolts you need to break loose and everything. Just use a bunch of extensions and swivels and all that good stuff, and make sure you break loose your slave cylinder, your clutch slave cylinder. You're going to take that off, and all your wiring to transmission to the car. Okay, up top there, you got your first bolt. And then right to the right of that is where your crank angle sensor goes in and bolts down. Your crank angle sensor bolt is a 10mm bolt, and it has the metal plate on it so it don't get damaged. You have to remove that before you remove your transmission, or else you'll get tore up. So you have that one up, that bolt up there, which is they're all 14mm. You have another one right there, 14mm. You have another one right there, 14mm. Then you have one right there, which is a gusset bolt, and then you have another one right there, it's a gusset bolt. This gusset bolt right here is threaded, so it goes through, but this gusset bolt here has a nut with it. And then you go over on this side, you have two more gusset bolts. They both have nuts for them. Neither side's threaded, you just have that one side that's threaded. Make sure you remove your slave cylinder. You have another bolt right there, which I still have on you. That's my last one I've got to take off. You have your two starter motor bolts. And then you have another one up top there where that hose is. That's the last one on top. And that bracket actually goes through it with that hoop on it. As you can see, it's kind of a tight space. Here's your crank angle sensor. I'll show you why it's out of the car. This is the metal bracket, the metal plate that goes on top of it. It goes on top of it like that, and you have the 10mm nut that screws down through it onto the transmission. I just use this little small ratchet and a 10mm 10mm socket to get it off. If you got the transmission dropped enough and it's angled back enough, you'll be able to get it off, as well as all the other bolts. And most of the transmission bolts I got off with a regular extension and then a wobble and then your 14mm socket. But the ones a couple on top, like the top right one with the hoop on it for the hose, I used two extensions, and I was able to get that. And when you can't break them loose, I use this breaker bar right here. It's basically just a pipe that I put on the end of it. Works real well. I got them all off with that. I had no problems. When you go to remove this, be extra careful. I'm going to pick up on it, just wiggle it back, get you some grip on it. And
Slide it down real easily. You don't want to break nothing or tear nothing up. Okay, now that you got it out, just slide it out from under the car. As you've probably seen, my neutral position switch was still connected, so I had to remove that while it was under there. It's no fun doing this under the car like this, and you can easily hurt yourself, so be extra careful. And if you got someone that can help you, that would be even better. Because as you see, I have to do it by myself, which is very dangerous and not safe in itself, but you gotta do what you gotta do sometimes. And also watch out for the rear of the transmission to leak out fluid all over you. So make sure you got dirty clothes on too. Okay, you got the transmission out. You want to pull the throwout bearing off the fork, and it just slides right off. The fork comes off the pivot there. You just pull it out the dust collar, and then take you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bolts all the way around. They're 12mm bolts you need to pull off to remove your front cover there and leave your nipple on. The front cover is pulled off. You can see the 3 rods there. They're all flush. It'll tell you that they're all in neutral position. If one of them's pushed back or pulled out a little forward or whatever, and you can't get the shifter to move it, then you're going to have to break the rear end apart and do it like I showed you with the rods back there. Like I say, just go ahead and put a bolt shifter up to the transmission. Make sure it shifts good. Go through every gear, spin the input shaft, make sure it spins freely. And other than that, you should be good. Place your front seal on that. Get you the gasket here for it. There is a metal seal in here, metal ring. Make sure that does not fall out, you don't lose that. Make sure you have it back in there before you install it into the transmission, because it touches the bearing lip right here, and you need that for when that spins so don't gouge out the inside of the front cover there. And usually you want to inspect it too. If it's scarred up real bad or tore up or bent up or ate up, I'd replace that, because that keeps it from tearing up the front cover there. Also, on the transmission, before you go to remove it, you need to remove your speed sensor. This is an S13 transmission right here, but the S14 transmission speed sensor is in the same spot. Has a 10mm nut on the bottom of it. Remove that, and then you pull it out. You just pull it straight out. It's held in there by a rubber O-ring, and that's it. It's got like a plastic wheel on it, and on the rod inside the transmission's got a plastic gear on it too, and that's what the speed sensor hooks to. That's how it reads your speed. And now I got my transmission out. Since my shift linkage and stuff was not right, I guess whoever had it before screwed up. It wasn't even shifting the gear when I had it in the car. I should have checked all this out before, but I just figured it'd be okay. When you're going to pull the rear end off the transmission, the gearbox is in the middle here, in between the rear end and the bell housing. What you gotta do is remove all the bolts around, and then take a scraper and a hammer and break loose all the liquid gasket, RTV, whatever it is, around there. And you have a couple dowel pins, nipples. There. You have 2 of them on there. After you get the RTV broke loose, you need to knock them off those nipples right here. You have little striking points here and here to hit it with a hammer. Don't knock it really hard, just kind of tap it off and just kind of wiggle it back and forth, break it loose off of them, and then pick that thing up. But before you go to take it off, you have to remove your striking arm, which is right here. And then there's a little pin inside here. I'm just using an old screwdriver that broke loose. That'll fit inside the hole. Then I have a magnetic one stuck behind here, so it'll catch the pin when it falls out, when it knocks out the back, so it don't fall down the gearbox and all that good stuff. End up losing it. So as soon as you knock this out, you can pick the whole rear end up just a little bit until you got enough to pull the striker arm out, because you have to remove it anyways to get that out, because there's not enough room to pull that back to get the striking arm off. Okay, I got the rear end off the transmission. I want to show you a few things on here. This hole on this arm right here is where your striking arm went, which is this piece right here. actually sat on there just like that, and your shifter goes right in there, pulls it back and forth and moves it side to side. It's locked on to this rod right here, and as you can see, this rod goes down to another rod which goes through all three of these. And as you can see, it goes through all three of them, which means if it can go through all three of them, it's in neutral. All three of them's in neutral. You have this one here on this side's first and second gear, this one here is for third and fourth gear, and this one here is for fifth and reverse gear. Now it's on first gear right now. If I pressed it down, that would be first gear, and pulling it up would be second gear. Same with this one, would be down's third gear, up's fourth gear, down's fifth gear, up's reverse. And you can also, after you're doing that, you can put them in gear, you can spin the input shaft, check it, make sure it's, it spins freely and everything. So just check it all out, make sure everything's good on that. You check all your gears out and everything, your bearings, everything looks fine on this one. You have a leftover RTV here, scrape all that off, clean the surface off real good, and before you go put it all back on for your RTV at all. What you want to do, you want to go on the inside of the bolt holes everywhere, and on the inside of the dowels as well. Then also you have your shafts here. They're spring loaded. That's what keeps your shifter from going back and forth, like I was showing you on here. If it didn't have those spring loaded things, this shifter would be able to pop out like that, and that would not be good. If that popped out, you could pull the whole rod out and you'd have all kinds of messes. So before you go put it all together, make sure they're all in the middle. You could probably take one, press it down, or pull it up and make sure it's in the middle. When it's in the middle and in neutral, it'll wiggle a bit. It won't be as stiff. Just make sure they're all in neutral before you put them down. Just make sure that all three of them's running across, which will make them all in neutral before you put it all back on. Or else you'll end up with the same problem I had, and you have to pull your whole transmission off underneath your car and tear it apart just to fix this. So just a heads up on that. I would recommend doing this anyways, even if you bought it from a reputable person, just to make sure that everything's good. Go ahead and reseal it up, reseal the gasket up. I'm replacing my rear seal, which goes in right there. You want to cover the whole thing in motor oil. Press it in on the back. You can either use a tool or you can just press it in by hand, but make sure you got it flat all the way around, which that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to press it in by hand. Just make sure you have it pushed all the way back and it's all flush all the way around, or else you'll get an oil leak. Here, when you're going to install your rear end back on your transmission, line this input shaft up with a hole inside there, and there's plastic around that. I forgot to show you about that, but that's for the speed sensor. The speed sensor shoots in this hole right here and connects to that plastic around that rod there. And also make sure this rod goes through this hole here. And when you're starting to get in there, go ahead and put your striker arm in. As you're coming down on it, just go ahead and put your striker arm on here and let it fall down, and put it on there, push it on the nipples, and take your pin, the little dowel pin that goes inside there, knock it in there with a hammer. When you're putting the rear housing back on the transmission, all your bolts around, you want to torque them down to 15 foot-pounds, 14 to 15 foot-pounds. Okay, after you have your RTV on here, your liquid gasket on the shaft there, go ahead and install your rear end on your transmission. Just guide it down through there. Go real slow and take care of everything. Make sure you're not hitting nothing or tearing anything up. After you get it so far down, take your striking arm, go ahead and install it onto the shaft there, and go ahead and let it guide all the way down. And after that, all you gotta do is get it lined up with the dowel pins. And press it down on there. You get it, put all your bolts on. They're 12 millimeter. Do everything in a crisscross pattern. And you're torquing them down. Then when you have all that done, go ahead and install your dowel pin into your striking arm. Get that on there. Make sure your holes all lined up and everything. And that's that. Okay, if you use the JGS transmission mount, like I'm going to do, you have this plate that comes with it. Basically all it is for you to guide your holes, because you need to drill your holes out. The ones on the outside is the stock ones, and the ones on the inside's not. As you can see, I slotted mine out some, but it's no big deal. It's gonna still work the same way. Take your suspension, your transmission mount. It's actually an energy suspension mount, but this is what he uses. And these two bolt holes right here are the ones that bolt through these holes. And it bolts on. It don't really matter which way it goes on. It's pretty much the same way each way. And then when you're going to install the spacers here, this kit's made for a Z32 as well, the 300ZX. Make sure that you have it's a M10 and a 1.25 thread pitch and 40 millimeters long. That's what you need to go up underneath the car. Make sure they included the right one. Make sure it threads up into the bottom of the chassis. And if it don't, then you need to go to the hardware store and get an M10 1.25 times 40. You need to get 4 of these. You're gonna have one on each side, and then you got 2 more over here. Also on your stock transmission mount, this is the S14 transmission mount. As you can see, this is the one that's not cut. You got to cut the rubbers right there on the side and cut this whole piece out. End up looking like this. What you're going to end up doing is you're going to take your transmission mount. It's going to basically sit down in there, and then you're going to bolt that through to the transmission with the stock nuts and bolts for the transmission. The smaller nut bolts that come with it, but you don't use them for the 240, but you will for a Z32. I'm just putting them through the middle right now just to hold them on there instead of holding them on there by hand. And when I get these in and bolt them to the chassis, I'm going to pull that out. Or you could leave it in there too, whatever you like to do really. And that's basically it right there. If you're using the JGS training mount like I'm doing, you normally had to cut the stock mount out and then put this inside of it, but since I already had my stuff installed and had the transmission messed up and pulled out, I noticed that it raised the transmission up about that far. So I'm going to just go ahead and pull this off. If you're not using your exhaust tube mounting bracket, you don't need it anyways. All it's going to do, that's going to mount to the bottom of the transmission right there. Just like that. And that's what it's made to do anyways. It's made to mount right up to it. I'm not exactly sure why Lance at JGS wanted you to use this one for, except for the fact of the exhaust tube mounting bracket being on it. That's the only thing I can think of. But that's what I'm going to do. Mount up just like that. Transmission mount finished. You don't necessarily have to use these. You can probably use the stock ones. Since we pulled that bracket off, it would definitely fit. And then of course you got to put your adapters on. Remember, use the slots, not the tap ones. Tap ones are for the Z32s. The overhang goes towards the front of the car versus the back of the car. It goes towards the front. When you're going to remove your throwout bearing off your release sleeve, take a 26mm socket, fits right down in the hole. Just put it on a table or whatever. I just got it on some depot sockets right now. And after you get on there, just knock it out with a hammer, and it'll come right out. And then you can go ahead and replace your throwout bearing. Okay, when you're going to install your throwout bearing on your release sleeve, this is your release sleeve right here, and this is your throwout bearing. I just put mine in a vise and put 2 boards on each side, just so it don't damage them. And then just tighten up the vise. It'll go all the way down till they both touch each other. Make sure you get the throwout bearing started on the release sleeve first and get it going straight. After you get it installed in there, you'll see it's all the way down and pushed all the way into it. And on your throwout bearing, you got a side that spins on it. It's got this little piece on it that spins right here. Make sure that's pointing out and not into this side, because this is what touches your pressure plate. This end of the throwout bearing right there. And if you got it backwards, it's not going to work. You have to pull it back off. When you go to bolt down your front cover, make sure you got a gasket on it. Like I'm going to reuse mine because I had to put it on there, so it's still good. But make sure you got a new gasket on it. Make sure your ring here is still good. Make sure it's on there. run all your bolts in and torque them down to 15 foot-pounds. Alright, when you're going to grease up your transmission, you need to grease up the nipple right here. And then you need to go up on the shaft. You need to grease up the shaft right here where the release sleeve is going to go. And also put a little grease right here on the shaft itself too. So this right here with the teeth on it, that's actually what goes inside the clutch. And then the front part right here, this is what goes inside the your pilot bushing. So make sure you get this real smoothed out. You kind of want to clean it off real good. And if you have to, take some really fine sandpaper and smooth it off. If it's got a bunch of like rust on or caked on stuff that's hard to get off, make sure you get all that real clean. And just put a little bit of grease on everything, not a whole lot. Mainly right here is where your throwout bearing and your release sleeve is gonna move back and forth, so you need some on that. And then just a little bit here for the clutch, and then a little bit on this here for the pilot bushing. And grease up your nipple right here that your fork connects to. Also, before you install your fork, right here there's got a little indentation on it. Like on the front it's bumped out, but on the inside it's bumped in. That's actually what goes over your nipple right there. So put a little grease on that too, and a little on the spring right here on it. So it'll slide over this a whole lot better and gives it a little more lubrication to move back and forth. And also put a little bit on the outside right here. That's where your slave cylinder pushes down on the fork and make it move like that. And also put a little bit on the ends right here where it touches the release sleeve. So I'll get a little bit of grease on that. And also here on your release sleeve, you want to put a little bit on the inside too, because this is what actually goes on here and it slides back and forth. So you want to make sure you got good lubrication on that too. Okay, after you have your fork all greased up everywhere, go ahead and take your dust boot for it. Go ahead and slide your forking through it. Go ahead and install it on the transmission. I'm using a brand new one, so mine's a little stiff to get in. You can do it either way. You can install the boot first and then the fork, or however you want to do it. And then you just flip it around. You just flip it around and slide it onto the fork like that. The fork will just slide right in like that. And after you get it on, push your fork down onto the nipple. And then make sure, do not touch the front half right here of your throwout bearing with the grease, because it'll mess it up. But you want to give it a couple moves and make sure it's on there right. Make sure you get it all the way on the shaft and make sure it'll go all the way back. And when you got it back, make sure you give it a couple moves back and forth, get some grease worked in it, and make sure everything's moving properly and smoothly. Because if it goes just a little too far, it's going to pop off that lip and get stuck like that. But that's not that big a deal. Just make sure everything's going real smooth and you got everything greased up good. And make sure you don't touch the front of the throwout bearing that moves and spins on the pressure plate. If you do, wipe it off really good, because that'll cause your clutch to slip. Alright, when you're going to remove your automatic pilot bushing, you have this bushing on the front right here. You gotta set up your pilot bushing removal tool. It actually goes through the hole and sprawls out to grab a hold of the inside of it and pulls it out. Alright, after you got your bushing out, you need to take some sandpaper, and I'm using 1000 grit. You could probably use 800 grit, would be better, but just round it around your finger and stick it in the hole. And then twist it. Just get all that rust and nastiness out so the manual pilot bushing to go in there a whole lot easier. Okay, when I went to install my pilot bushing, I used a 12mm socket to knock it in. I do not recommend that because I just did it and it pretty much tore it all up and warped it, so even the alignment tool wouldn't go inside it. So I tried to pull it out and couldn't get pulled out, so I used a screwdriver and a hammer and chiseled it through till it broke in half. But be careful because don't gouge out the inside of your wall if you go that route. Just go real slow with it and make sure you get it out without tearing it up. Next one I put in, I used a piece of wood. I cut it in about half. You start knocking it in so it's not going to mess it up at all. And after you get it so far, it's going to start chopping the wood off on the edge and going inside the hole, and it's not going to work anymore. So I took an old alignment tool I had and inserted it in there and knocked it the rest of the way in, and that worked really well actually. That's probably the best bet is get you an old alignment tool and knock it in with that. Possibly start off with a board. Like I said before, make sure you get the pilot bushing going in straight to start with, and then knock it all the way in. It has a little groove on the front right here. It kind of bevels back a little bit, so just make sure you got it back that far. You can also stick your finger in there, but it's kind of hard to feel it, but you got probably about that much more room before you hit the back wall, but it's not going to go that far because there's a little indentation on the inside of the hole about halfway, so it won't go past that. So as soon as you get back as far as you can get it, you'll know because it won't go back any further. And it's right on the edge of that bevel too, so. Okay, the pilot bushing is the copper looking thing on the inside there. And this wall right here is where your automatic bushing was on the inside of. And there is a little bevel right there on the edge where it just touches to. And that's as far back as you need to go. While you're knocking your pilot bushing in, if you use your tool or not, just keep a check on it and keep making sure that your alignment tool will go inside there. Because if your alignment tool won't go inside the pilot bushing, then your shaft on your transmission is definitely not going to go in there. Just keep a check on that. And if you end up messing it up, you can take a Dremel and try and smooth it out on the inside, but more than likely you're going to have to put another pilot bushing in there. So I'd recommend at least having 2 pilot bushings just in case. When you go to install your dust plate, make sure the punch out's on this side. You'll know it because your starter hole will be on this side. You have a nipple here and here that goes on. When you go to install your flywheel, I'm using the Fidenza lightweight flywheel. There's a little hole on it right here, which on your crankshaft, there's a hole right here between where the bolts go, and there's usually a little nipple on there, like on the 5-speeds. The automatic one, I guess, don't have one, but I haven't yet to hear of anybody needing to get one and find one and put it in. But you need to line this hole up with this hole here. That's how you know you got it on there straight. Make sure you get all the metal shavings off of it if they didn't get them off. Might have a few on there. And any kind of bolt or nut that has a torque setting, you need to put motor oil on the threads of it so it'll torque up properly. Go ahead and install your 2 bolts on there. Go ahead and get the flywheel to sit all the way back. When you go to install these, keep tightening in a crisscross pattern because you want it to go down flat. You don't want it to go on sideways. So just get it till it hits the very back of it, and then you'll be ready to install the rest of them on there and torque it down. The torque on all of them is 112 foot-pounds. I'll show you a way to hold it down so it don't spin. Okay, when you're going to torque down your flywheel, as you can see, I got the chain from the engine lift, the excess hanging over. I used one of your bell housing bolts just run it back through and put a washer on it, and then run one of your clutch pressure plate bolts through the flywheel with the washer on it. You got to torque them down to 112 foot-pounds. Do it in a crisscross pattern. Do not forget your dust plate before you put the flywheel on, or you're gonna have to pull the flywheel back off. After you got them all torqued down, go back and check over all of them, make sure they're all torqued. All your flywheel bolts are 19 millimeter. Pressure plate bolts are 12 millimeter. Okay, when you're going to install your clutch, this is your clutch disc right here. You have two sides to it. This side here sticks out, where this side here does not. So the flatter side is the side that goes towards the flywheel. The flywheel will be back on this side. So all you need to do is take just a little bit of grease and get it inside the shaft here. You get too much grease in here, it'll start oozing out, and if it gets on the clutch facing, it could cause your clutch to slip. All right, now we're going to take our clutch alignment tool, going to insert it inside the clutch, just like that. Just slide it through there. And this end right here, remember when you was installing your pilot bushing, this end right here goes inside the pilot bushing. Next on your flywheel, after you got your pressure plate in, comes these little dowels. They go into the holes here, the holes with no screws in it. You have there's a little edge on this side and there's a bigger edge on this side. The bigger edge goes inside the flywheel. It actually hooks it sits your pressure plate on it before you bolt it up. This is your pressure plate right here. All you gotta do is find the holes. There's a few of them that can go in, but put one right here, and right here, all on opposite ends. There's no real certain way for the clutch to go on. It'll pretty much only go on one way. Just get them lined up with those dowels. Okay, when you're going to install your pressure plate, like I showed you before, you had the nipples. Just keep spinning your pressure plate over until you get the nipples to line up. There's only one way it will line up. Really the reason they do that is because they probably use the pressure plates for various cars, so they have different hole settings for them and everything. And when you go to tighten it down, and also to torque it down, you want to do it in crisscross type of pattern. Like say you start here, this will be 1, you'll skip 1 to number 2, you'll skip another one to number 3, then you'll skip over 2 to number 4, then you'll skip over 1 more to 5, then you'll skip over 2 more, well 1 more to 6. And that's the tighten sequence you want to go. And when you get it snug down, you want to torque it down in 2 settings. First time you want to hit them at 14 foot-pounds, and then after you get them all tightened up in that numeric order I showed you, then go back around and tighten them all up to 22 foot-pounds. That'll be your final torque setting on there. Then when you get done with that, you can pull your alignment tool out. This is another way from keeping the motor from spinning over when you can't use the chain method. I still have my engine on lift, so what I did was I put a ratchet on this breaker bar I have here. It's just a pipe. Hooked it to the crank bolt there, and then just released the motor down until it hit right at the ground where that thing goes up. And the bar sits right underneath the bar of the lift right here. So then after I did that, I could come over here and torque my clutch bolts down, and the bar would lift up, and it wouldn't let it spin anymore. And that's a good way to do it. And after you get all that done, you can pull the alignment tool out. Okay, when you're going to install your manual transmission onto your motor, make sure you got all your shaft lubed up and everything. Make sure you got all your grease on it. And basically all you're doing is you're sticking this in the hole of the clutch, through the clutch. This is going through the pilot bushing, and then the one with the teeth on it's the one that's actually going through the clutch. So that's where you're going to have your problem at, is getting the teeth in the clutch. So you might have to turn a little bit, pull it back off and turn a little bit, you know, do a little bit of wrestling with it. It should slide around on there. You shouldn't have too much problem with it. It'll take a couple tries to get it. I'm going to grab about the midways of the transmission nuts so you get the weight kind of like balanced out. And we got it on. Okay, when you're going to install your gussets, you got the driver's side here. It gets the smaller gusset, but the passenger side gets the bigger gusset. Basically all it does is connects the motor and the transmission together, gives it more of a support. It goes on just like that. You need to get your transmission up on a jack. It's a pretty daunting task in itself because you're going to have to get the transmission under the car first and then put it on the jack, because you can get your jack stands up high, which I just got these regular Pro lifts here, which don't go up too high. I think they're like 17 inches up is what they'll go. But right there on the jack, that's pretty much the balancing point. Then you have the little stopper there for when you knock it with a hammer to knock the rear end off of the transmission. That's pretty much the balancing point there. So you want to get there, get it lined up in the middle so it's balanced and level, and then you'll jack it up to your where your input shaft goes into the clutch. So if you're doing it like me by yourself, then it's going to be pretty much a daunting task, and you want to give yourself pretty much the biggest part of the day to do this, because when you get it up there and you actually get it into the input shaft, into the clutch, you'll have to probably spin the input shaft a couple times to get it to go into the clutch, so you have to pull it back off a couple times. But when you get on there, then you have to get the transmission to go into the nipples onto the motor. Just wiggle it, grab that when you get it up there into the input shaft and it's going in, just grab the back of it while you're holding it and just kind of wiggle it on there. And then go ahead and install you a couple bolts to hold it on there, and then remove the jack and go ahead and install the rest of them. Okay, I got my transmission on my motor now. Sorry I couldn't videotape it for you, it wasn't working out. It was actually being a pain in the butt to get on there. But what you have to do is balance it on transmission like I showed you with the jack. After you jack it up a little ways, you're going to have to push up top. You're going to have to push up on the bell housing there. That's going to make the transmission want to slide back off the jack, which I had tons of problems with that, and the thing falls off the jack, and you know, you could probably break something or tear up something. So like I said, I would not recommend this anyways. I would recommend just pulling the whole motor out and putting the transmission on and putting it all back in. It's so much simpler, and I could have done it in like 2 hours less of time. But like I say, it's doable. You can do it, because I just did it by myself. You just gotta wiggle it on there. I mean, once you get the input shaft going into the clutch, just grab the back of it and wiggle it up and down until it slides all the way in, and the transmission goes onto the nipples, and go ahead and bolt you a couple bolts down and jack it up there to get your cross member bolted up to the chassis. Get that on there, and then after you get the cross member to the chassis, you can remove the jack completely. Top bolt up there for last, and don't forget to install your hoop bracket onto the bolt. But to get that bolt on there and tighten down, I'm using alright, after you get your transmission bell housing bolts all tightened down and torqued down, your 4 gusset bolts on the bottom's 29 foot-pounds, and the top ones and all the bell housing bolts are like 32 foot-pounds. But just get them as tight as you can, because you're probably not going to be able to get a torque wrench on half of them. So Just get them as tight as you can. And then you want to go ahead and put your starter back on. Basically all it does is it just slides in the hole and you run the bolts through and tighten it down. Which it runs in there, and the gears on the inside of the starter, the gear right here, that's what actually touches the flywheel, and that's how that works. After you got your starter motor in, go ahead and install your crank angle sensor and hook up the wiring on it, and screw your 10mm nut down, and don't forget to put your metal plate on top. As you can see here on the inside of the drive shaft, there's a bunch of teeth around it, but there's a little notch on this side and this side. That means it will only go in one way. Usually you got a yellow line on the bottom of the drive shaft. Let's see. See that yellow line back there? That's usually on the bottom, depending on where it's spun. But usually I put that on the bottom because that'll level it up with the marks. So then you can just slide it right in. The best thing to do is go ahead and have your brace hooked on, that brace back there, and just slide it over the top of that, the back of it that goes to the differential. And after you get it slid back enough to slide the front of it into the back of the transmission, and slide it into the transmission, and go ahead and hook it up back to the differential, and then go ahead and hook your center bearing bolts up. Before you put your shifter on, you want to go ahead and pour your transmission fluid down in the hole here before you go ahead and install your shifter. Basically underneath the striker plate to the sides of it, it's hard to see in here, but that's where it goes down into the transmission gearbox, and that's where the transmission fluid goes in. This hole right here is where the end of your shifter goes into, and of course it bolts in right here. We're going to put some, if your stock gasket is no good, we're just going to put a little bit of RTV on the bottom of the shifter before we put it in. And also, on this hole right here, don't forget to put your check ball and spring on there. Put the check ball in first and then the spring on top, and then put the shifter on and bolt it down. Okay, after you have all your transmission fluid in there, you have your check ball installed, your spring installed. As far as the transmission fluid, you need 2.7 quarts of gear oil. I'm using the Redline 75W90. It's really good stuff. I recommend it. So basically what you're going to do, you're going to need 2 of these. You're going to pour out about half of it, and then you'll have half left, and you're going to pour out another half of it. So 3/4 of one bottle and 2 full ones will be 2.7 quarts. You buy the aftermarket shifter like I did. It's the B&M knockoff. If you use the B&M, you ain't gonna have no problem, but if you use the B&M knockoff, you take this plastic piece off of your stock 5-speed shifter, because the one they send is too thick and it won't fit down in the hole in the striker arm. Go ahead and take some lithium-based grease and pack this little plastic thing in your shifter with grease, and go ahead and run a bead around on the inside of the bolt holes with RTV or your stock gasket if you still had it, and then go ahead and install it. This little plastic thing right here goes in the hole right here on the striker arm. That's where that goes. Then you go ahead and bolt your 4 down, and you got to get underneath the car to get the top 2 front bolts. They're 12mm. Just snug them down pretty tight. You ain't got to torque them down or anything. When you go to install your slave cylinder on the transmission, you got 2 14mm bolts there. You need to torque them down to 30 foot-pounds. And then when you go to bleed your clutch system, you have the bleeder screw right there. It's a 10mm screw. My steel braid line runs all the way behind the brake booster there into the master cylinder right there. It's real simple to install. You need to, if you use it, you need to install it on the slave cylinder first, because this fitting right here has the movable fitting on it, where the one on the slave cylinder doesn't. So you're not going to be able to hook it up that way. You have to do the slave cylinder first and then come up to the master cylinder, tighten it down, and then you'll be good to go on that. And then on your clutch pedal, if you did like I did and run a straight line from the master cylinder to the slave cylinder down below, you only take about 2 or 3 bleeds. But basically what you do is you open up the bleeder on the slave cylinder, pump the clutch pedal by hand a couple times to get pedal pressure, lock the bleeder screw down, Of course, it's going to take two people to do this because one person, it's almost impossible for one person to do it. After you got that locked down, you got a little bit of pedal pressure. Pump the pedal about 5-6 times. Hold it to the floor. Release the bleed screw on the slave cylinder. Let it bleed, then tighten it up, and pump the pedal again about 5-6 times. Hold it to the floor. Open up the bleeder on the slave cylinder. You just keep doing that basically until you get really good pedal pressure and there is no bubbles coming out of your clear hose. You need to use the clear hose on that too, I might add. Just connect it to the bleeder on the slave cylinder so you can see all the fluid coming out. You can make sure you ain't got no bubbles coming out.